They are one of the most misunderstood bands of all time, but whether you love them, hate them, don't know anything about them, it's time that we talk about the top 10 Grateful Dead albums. Now, this is my opinion, of course, my 10 favorite Grateful Dead albums. Yours may vary or you may know nothing, but whether you're a Grateful Dead neophyte or a dyed-in-the-wool deadhead sitting around wearing tie-dye right now, I think you'll find this very interesting. What are the top 10 Grateful Dead albums of all time? Well, let's back off for a second. Why are the Grateful Dead so misunderstood? I've come across a lot of people who will say, oh, I don't really like the Grateful Dead. And of course, being a wise guy, I'll say, well, what songs or albums of the Grateful Dead do you know that you don't care for? I say, well, I don't know. I just don't like that kind of music. I'll say, well, what kind of music is that kind of music? You know, that heavy metal, motorcycle gang music. Well, here's the thing. The Grateful Dead are not a heavy metal band. They're not a heavy rock band. The Grateful Dead are an amazing amalgamation of many different types of American music. They combine rock, bluegrass, jazz, folk, what we today would call Americana, and just kind of seamlessly mix it up and go from one genre to the next in a way that no other band has ever done before. So if you say you don't like the Grateful Dead, I'd say there's probably a good chance that you have not listened to enough Grateful Dead, because they really are one of those bands that has something for everybody. And of course, there's nothing like experiencing the Grateful Dead live. Now, sadly, since Jerry Garcia passed away in 1995, we're not able to do that anymore, but you can certainly relive a Grateful Dead show through so many of their live recordings. It's not like being there. I'm glad to say I was there many, many times starting in the 70s. But if you weren't, it's not too late. It's too late to see them live, but it's not too late to get into some of their great recorded music. So let's talk about what are the 10 best, the top 10 Grateful Dead albums. Now, except with one exception, I'm going to leave out this massive amount of albums that's been released since Jerry's passing, and sometimes even before Jerry's passing. The whole concert vault was just raided and released. There are so many official Grateful Dead live albums that have come out, but I'm going to stick with the albums that were either studio albums or came out kind of in order. So they were more or less official albums on the Grateful Dead timeline, with one exception, and we'll make that album number 10. So let's start with my 10th favorite Grateful Dead album. It's called Cornell 5877. The 5877 refers to May 8th, 1977, where they had one of their most legendary concerts ever in Barton Hall at Cornell University. Now, you could debate for hours with Deadheads what's the greatest Grateful Dead concert ever, and nobody will ever agree on it. But a lot of people will point to this Cornell show, and for many, many, many years, it remained unreleased. Finally, these tapes that were recorded by Betty, who sat at the soundboard, they were known as the Betty tapes. A very high-quality Betty tape of the Cornell show was released. Now, something interesting that you need to know about Grateful Dead concerts, unlike just about every band and artist out there, the Grateful Dead don't do a show that's comprised of their hits and then a few obscurities and album tracks and maybe new songs. That's most concerts. When you go see a band, especially a legacy act, there's a certain body of work that they're expected to play, and that's a great thing, and usually they come through and play those songs and everybody's happy. Well, the Grateful Dead were never that kind of band. They wouldn't play the same set twice. If you saw them 3 nights in a row, they might not even repeat one song. So if you were there thinking, well, these are the 5 most popular Grateful Dead songs, they're bound to play 3 or 4 of those, there's a really good chance you'd be disappointed. So that's what the Dead were like in concert. That's one of the reasons they got such a following that would go from town to town to town, because you never knew what to expect. You never knew what songs to expect, or even what versions of songs to expect at a Dead show. So this Cornell show was legendary. You know, the Grateful Dead were known for their spaced out, long improvisations. They did that many, many a night. And that's one of the differences in this Cornell show. It's a little more compact. You might even say a good show for Grateful Dead beginners if you want to hear a classic Dead show. It's not too crazy. They've got a fantastic version of Scarlet Begonias Leading into Fire on the Mountain. They just started to do that. One of their great, great concert moments when they do that. It has a superb version of a song called Morning Dew, which is one of my favorite Grateful Dead concert songs. One that if you happen to listen to this album, pay particularly close attention to that. But Cornell 5877, number 10 on my list, excellent example of a superb mid to late 70s Grateful Dead concert. Okay, let's get back to the studio for number 9. Number 9 Grateful Dead album is Oxomoxoa. I was never sure how to pronounce that until finally a Deadhead said it's not Oxomoxa, it's Oxomoxoa. It's Aoxomoxa. I believe it's a palindrome. Spells the same way backwards and forwards. Oxomoxoa is from the Grateful Dead's early period. It's really their third official studio album. I'm guessing that places it around 68 or 69 maybe. The Grateful Dead's first album was, I hate to say it, don't be offended, Deadheads, kind of a pedestrian reworking of some traditional songs and some of their early songs. They just sound like a typical blues rock band with a psychedelic edge, like many other San Francisco bands at that time. Their second album, Anthem of the Sun, got a lot more experimental. So experimental, I think some of you may find it unlistenable. And when it came to studio work, which they never really were all that fond of, they hit their stride with Oxomoxoa. It was one of the first rock albums or commercial rock albums recorded on a 16-track recording machine. Supposedly they went way over budget. They were in debt to Warner Brothers. They weren't interested in money. They were just interested in doing the most unique recordings and the best recordings. And that's what they did with Oxomoxoa. It's got a bunch of songs that are still in the Dead offshoots repertoire to this day. Saint Stephen, Mountains of the Moon, China Cat, Sunflower, just a bunch of great songs, really interesting album. Sounds a bit dated today, but I think good enough and significant enough to make it the 9th best Grateful Dead album. Okay, album number 8. This one, probably not many people would put this as the number 8, but I'm going to do it anyway. It's called Reckoning, and it's a live album from 1981. The Dead went on a kind of a small theater tour that year. They played the Warfield in San Francisco and Radio City Music Hall in New York, sold out multiple nights at each venue, and they started with an acoustic set, and then they went to an electric set. Now, we were mostly used to seeing the Dead play electric instruments. So this acoustic set that they started each show with was really something special. But here, Jerry Garcia and Bob Weir next to each other, just playing acoustic guitar like an old folk act, and then the drummers were using brushes and an upright piano. It's just a really, really different sound. I happen to love it. It's a fine recording. Some of their classics, just done in different versions. Direwolf, Birdsong, Cassidy, they're all great on this album. And then they did some real traditional folky songs like Deep Ellum Blues and Monkey and the Engineer. I'm trying to think of the other one they called it. On the Road Again. Great songs. You may not know them by name, but these are songs you probably heard in the background a million times over. So a very different sounding album for the Dead because it was all acoustic. Reckoning. Okay, number 7 is a Grateful Dead studio album from 1975, and it's called Blues for Allah. Now, Blues for Allah, in my opinion, marked a new level of experimentation for the Dead, but not free-form acid jamming experimentation, but one that really combined a jazzy sound with a rock and roll sound. Side 1, for those of you who still listen to vinyl, of Blues for Allah is absolutely one of their finest works ever. Help on the Way Slipknot into a song called Franklin's Tower, which you may recognize from the refrain, roll away the dew, roll away the dew. You've probably heard it a million times. Goes into a great little percussive jam, and then the music never stops. So side 1 is pretty much flawless. One of my favorite Grateful Dead album sides of all time. Side 2 gets a little more experimental, and then into this kind of trippy, I guess you'd call it a Middle Eastern Arabic type sounding music. Can't say it's one of my favorites. I don't really dig it that much. I appreciate what they were trying to do and the experimentation of it, but in spite of that, side 1 of Blues for Allah is so strong that it gets my vote for the 7th best Grateful Dead album of all time. Okay, album number 6 is called Grateful Dead, colloquially known as Skull and Roses. Doesn't have any writing on the cover, just this kind of freaky, beautiful artwork of Skull and Roses. Now, the Dead's original intent was to call this album Skullfuck, which back in 1971, when it was released, of course, there's no way that Warner Brothers Records would ever let them release them with that title. So they decided not to put any writing on the cover and just call it Grateful Dead. But most people know it as Skull and Roses. It's a live album. It's not totally spaced out or jammed out. Features a lot of maybe more traditionally length songs. It's really well played. So again, some songs that remained in the Grateful Dead repertoire for the rest of their career. Bertha. The other one is a side long, kind of epic. It's got a lot of percussive jamming in it. Very cool Grateful Dead intro. But I think the highlight of this album is side 4, a song called Wharf Rat, maybe a slower Jerry song, goes into Not Fade Away, the old Buddy Holly song that we all recognize. The Rolling Stones did it. Everybody did that. The Dead do a great version of it. And then that segues into Going Down the Road Feeling Bad. Just a classic Grateful Dead concert moment. The entire album is strong. Highly recommended if you want to hear what the Grateful Dead sounded like live back in 1971. Skull and Roses. Okay, next. Now, this is going a little bit of an offshoot, not actually a Grateful Dead album. It's a Jerry Garcia solo album called Garcia. Now, in 1972, the Grateful Dead they had so much material and they were getting so popular and had such a great following, they were kind of given permission to each do some solo albums. So the percussionist Mickey Hart did a solo album called Rolling Thunder. Bob Weir did a solo album called Ace, although that was really more like a Grateful Dead album because all the members of the Dead played on it, but it was all Bob Weir songs. That was called Ace. And then Jerry Garcia came up with what I feel is the best of the bunch. He played just about every instrument on it, so not really a traditional Grateful Dead album, but it sure sounds like the Grateful Dead, and they took many of these songs and put them in their live repertoire. Just a really cool album. Deal, Sugary, Loser, these are all highlights, but every song is good. There's a little bit of an experimental psychedelic piece on side 2, which is really cool. Just a great album, plays all the way through. All Jerry Garcia songs, of course. That was number 5. Number 4, Grateful Dead album of all time, From the Mars Hotel. And it's called From the Mars Hotel, but it's not a live album. There is no real Mars Hotel. Again, it's from 1974. This is an album where the Dead actually seem to be a lot more comfortable in the studio. They always claim they weren't a studio band. They didn't like it in there. For some reason, to me, this one stands out as an album where they were just comfortable and relaxed in the studio. It starts with U.S. Blues, absolutely one of their most fun, danceable, cool tracks. Unbroken Chain by the bass player Phil Lesh is an absolute highlight. He didn't get that many songs as a songwriter and singer with the Dead, but this is a great one. It's got a really cool jazzy instrumental interlude where they play around with time signatures a bit, then they bring it back to the theme of the song. Just a really great classic. Scarlet Begonias, another Dead classic. And this song's got 2 of the best, what I call Jerry moaners. I mean, Jerry could be known for doing these slow songs. He kind of moans the vocals. He'll play a beautiful, delicate lead guitar. Early in my days of learning to love the Grateful Dead, it took me a while to really appreciate and get into the moaners, especially live. But like with most Dead fans, I learned to love the moaners. And 2 of his finest are on this album, China Doll and Ship of Fools. So From the Mars Hotel, great album, plays all the way through. Every song is worth a listen. I think you'll really enjoy it. Now, Keith Godshaw, the piano player, really puts in some absolutely fine work on this album. So one you should check out. Okay, now we're getting some rarefied air here. The top 3 Grateful Dead albums of all time. Number 3 is a studio album from 1970 called Working Man's Dead, which I think back in 1970 really took everybody by surprise. They were coming off this streak of not just studio albums, but of concerts where they were known for their psychedelic sounds and their long tripped out jams, and who knows what song was going to go into what, just this crazy cosmic blend of music. Then they come out with this album, Working Man's Dead, which is pretty much a straight ahead folk rock album. They were very influenced by Crosby, Stills, and Nash. As a matter of fact, legend has it that Jerry Garcia and Bob Weir, the 2 principal vocalists, took vocal harmony lessons from Crosby, Stills, and Nash so they could just get that great sound. And if you know the song Uncle John's Band, the lead-off song on this album, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Beautiful harmonies. Sounds like it could have been At Home on a CSN album. This album is bookended by 2 of their absolute finest songs ever. Starts out with Uncle John's Band, closes the full 8 songs on it. It closes with Casey Jones, a song you might know is Riding That Train I was driving that train. I can't believe I'm messing this up. Driving that train. High on cocaine. Just a great Grateful Dead song. Many good ones in between there too. Cumberland Blues is a standout. Dire Wolf has great Jerry Garcia pedal steel on it. So it just sounded like it fit in with the times. It was a real departure for them. The cover is just this kind of sepia-toned, Western themed, really establishing the Grateful Dead as one of the great and earliest Americana bands. You will love every moment. Okay, number 2. Now we're back to the live albums. This is my personal favorite Grateful Dead live album. It's called Europe 72. Obviously, it was recorded in Europe in 1972. Now, one of the strange things about the Grateful Dead live, of the many, many strange things about the Grateful Dead live, is they would often do many, many songs that they hadn't recorded yet on their studio albums. So usually when you see a band, most of the songs, whether they're hits or obscurities, were from one of their studio albums, and maybe they'll have some new songs that they'll play, but a big fan would know just about all the songs. The Dead were different. They premiered songs live, and then if the songs were good enough, would put them on a live album. So there were a bunch of songs in Europe 72 that were not heard of as studio songs when they made it to the album, and then became familiar songs to Grateful Dead fans. Songs like Jack Straw, He's Gone, Tennessee Jed, these all became Grateful Dead classics. And unless you got to see them live in Europe, or maybe earlier, they were really notably released for the first time on Europe 72. Europe 72 has a great version of the classic Truckin', and before that it has something called Epilogue, and then it goes into Prologue, which are basically just Grateful Dead noodling and jamming and doing things that no other band could do, just kind of taking you on a little flight. So that will give you a real flavor of what it was like to hear the Dead in concert. And then the Prologue leads into an amazing live version of Morning Dew, just simply outstanding. So what's the best Grateful Dead live album? We can get a million opinions. I think it's Europe 72. You know, it's funny, we were talking earlier about what is the greatest Grateful Dead concert of all time. I think the best Grateful Dead concert of all time is the one that you saw as your first Grateful Dead concert. It's really tough to beat that. I know for me, it was in the late 70s. It was amazing. It just blew my mind and changed my opinion of what a live show could be like. And that's really when I became a lifelong Dead fan. So what is the best Grateful Dead album? What's numero uno? It's an album that was recorded at the same time. You might even call it a companion album to Working Man's Dead, but in my opinion, it just takes the level of greatness up a little bit. It followed Working Man's Dead, but was also released in 1970, and that album is called American Beauty. It's a stone cold classic. I think if you were to poll Dead fans all over the world and said, what is their finest studio album, this will win by far. Again, it's got that folk rock sound, but it's got some classics that are just embedded in us. Sugar Magnolia, Friend of the Devil, Ripple, Broke Down Palace, and again, it culminates in their most famous song of all time, Truckin'. This is the classic studio version of Truckin'. You just cannot hear this too many times. Something, if you're not a big Dead fan, a song that you might not be aware of on American Beauty is Box of Rain. It's the opening track. It's written and sung by Phil Lesh, the bass player. It's just a brilliant song. The lyrics are very melancholy. The melody is memorable. It's one of the best Dead songs ever, which is really unusual because it's a Phil Lesh song. So there you have it, the top 10 Grateful Dead albums. If you're curious about the Grateful Dead, if you're not sure which album to go to first, this will be a great place to start. I hope you really enjoyed it. My name is Rich. This is for people who love music. So please subscribe. There's lots more good stuff to come. And I'll see you at the next show.